and welcome to AFM 451. This video explains what cognitive biases are, how they distort professional judgment, and why auditors must treat them as a structural audit risk. Let's get started. Cognitive biases are systematic, predictable distortions in how we perceive evidence, assess probability, and of course, draw conclusions. They're not random mistakes. They do not disappear with intelligence or good intentions. In auditing, bias matters because audit product is a judgment. Auditors translate incomplete evidence into a conclusion under uncertainty. If judgment is biased, audit risk rises even when the underlying accounting is correct. Biases become especially dangerous because audit environment reinforces them. Time budgets, client relationships, hierarchical teams, and repeated patterns in prior year files. The point is not that auditors are careless. The fact is that the brain economizes and the economy can misfire in predictable ways. Let's walk through select common biases and see how they impact our professional judgment. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, overweigh, or remember evidence that supports an initial belief while discounting contradictory evidence. In an audit, this often starts with an early narrative: controls look strong, or management is competent, or nothing went wrong last year. Once that story forms, the auditor's testing can quietly shift from investigation to mere validation. Contradictory items get explained away as exceptions, timing issues, or noise. For example, early analytical procedures show that revenue is up 18% and that gross margin is stable. Right? The team now believes that revenue recognition is likely fine. Later, when they see a small cluster of, let's say, large or end-of-quarter sales with unusual items, confirmation bias tends to lead them in favor of benign explanations rather than escalation or further investigation. The error is not due to missing transactions, but it's in interpreting them through a pre-committed story. Anchoring bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on an initial number, assumption, or a prior expectation, and then just adjust insufficiently when new evidence appears. In auditing, anchors come from previous year's working papers, management forecasts, preliminary trial balance, or even planning materiality. For example, last year's allowance for doubtful accounts were 2% of receivables. Now the team will anchor on that benchmark. This year, macro conditions could have deteriorated, aging could have worsened, but the team's adjustment remains modest because previous year percentage feels normal. The result is an under-responsive judgment. Auditors move, but not enough, and anchoring is particularly problematic when environment changes, but the structure encourages continuity. Overconfidence is the tendency to overestimate one's ability to detect problems, assess risks, or interpret evidence correctly. In auditing, overconfidence shows up as a premature closure, stopping once the evidence seems sufficient, relying on intuition over testing, or underestimating the likelihood of fraud because I would notice it. I'm smart enough to catch it. Overconfidence is not arrogance, it's a cognitive compression. Experienced auditors can become efficient pattern matchers. That efficiency is valuable because it can also reduce sensitivity to weak signals. The audit consequences under auditing: too few procedures, too little corroboration, or excessive reliance on management's representation. Another one is motivated reasoning, which is interpreting ambiguous evidence in a way that aligns with a preferred outcome. The key feature is directional bias. The mind selectively accepts arguments that support what it wants to be true. In auditing, the preferred outcome is often not explicitly dishonesty. It can be finishing on time, or avoiding a conflict, or maintaining a client relationship, or even aligning with the engagement partner's tone or agenda. For example, an auditor finds that a key control was not performed for the last 2 months of the company due to staffing turnover. The evidence is ambiguous. Maybe the risk is contained. Perhaps it is systemic. Motivated reasoning, though, pushes towards the interpretation that avoids expanding the testing. Because expansion costs time. It creates friction. The auditor can still sound objective, but interpretation is quietly tilted towards convenience. Speaking of, time pressure amplifies every bias above by forcing faster decisions and encouraging reliance on mental shortcuts. When the team is behind budget, skepticism becomes expensive. Evidence evaluation becomes less about what does this mean and more about can we simply clear this and move on. Under time pressure, the brain defaults to the most available explanation, the most familiar prior approach, the least disruptive conclusion. Time pressure also affects documentation. If reasoning is not written down contemporaneously, it becomes rationalized after the fact, which further entrenches biases. In practice, time pressure is not just a scheduling issue. It is a risk factor that changes how evidence is processed. Hierarchy as well amplifies bias through difference or conformity. Junior staff auditors may see anomalies but may hesitate to challenge a senior's view. Seniors may interpret questions as inefficiency rather than insight. Partners may unintentionally signal the desired conclusion through tone, urgency, or simply framing. This is how biased judgments can become organizational rather than individual or engagement specific. If the engagement leader anchors on low-risk client, the team's evidence interpretation can converge around the anchor. Dissent decreases, contradictory evidence is softened, and file becomes coherent but wrong. So the central takeaway is that cognitive bias is not an ethics problem. It's a judgment design problem. Auditors must assume that bias is present, identify where it's likely to appear, and counter it through disciplined methods, structured risk assessment, explicit consideration of alternatives, requirement for disconfirming evidence, open dialogue, and of course, escalation protocol that protects dissent. Thanks for following along. Take care, stay safe, and bye for now.